Very hard to be patient here, but it's not working.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kathy Daneman, and on behalf of Mystery Writers of America, welcome to a discussion with our nominees for the Simon & Schuster Mary Higgins Clark Award. Before we begin, just a few notes. You can learn about upcoming Edgar panels by following us on social media using the hashtag Edgars2022 or by visiting the websites mysterywriters.org and theedgars.com. You can watch the Edgars live streamed on April 28th on our YouTube channel. I will be posting links to our panelists' books in the chat. Today's bookseller is Centuries and Sleuths in Forest Park, Illinois. Throughout the discussion, please submit questions in the Q&A box throughout the discussion, and we'll get to them toward the end of the hour. Now that we begin, I'm happy to introduce the moderator. R. Franklin James grew up in San Francisco Bay Area. A UC Berkeley graduate, she cultivated a different type of writing, legislation and public policy. After a career of political advocacy, she returned to her love of writing. Her debut novel, The Fallen Angels Book Club, was the first of 6 books in her Hollis Morgan mysteries. The books have been made into Lifetime movies. Her latest series, the Johanna Hudson Mysteries, opens with Book 1, The Inheritance, which has already received a Publishers Weekly must-read review. James resides in Northern California. Thank you, Ray, if you'd like to begin.
Hey, thank you, Kathy, and welcome everyone to the Simon & Schuster Mary Higgins Clark Award Virtual Symposium event. We're really excited about being here. I wanted to say, before we got started, I thought it would be a good idea to learn a little bit more about Mary Higgins Clark. She was born in 1927. She was an American author of suspense novels. Each of her 51 books was a bestseller in the United States and in European countries. All of her novels remain in print as of just a few years ago. Her suspense novels have sold more than 100 million copies in the United States alone. Higgins Clark began writing at an early age. After several years working as a secretary and copy editor, she spent a year as a stewardess, and she left her job to marry and start a family. She supplemented the family's income by writing short stories. Higgins Clark worked for many years writing 4-minute radio scripts until her agent persuaded her to write a novel. Her debut novel, a fictionalized account of the life of George Washington, that must have been a winner, flopped. But she was hooked as a writer, and she decided to exploit her love of mystery and suspense. Her first suspense attempt was the novel, Where Are the Children? Simon & Schuster agreed to purchase it for the relatively small sum of $3,000. 3 months later, in July 1974, she received word that the paper rights for the novel had sold for $100,000. 2 years after her first suspense book's publication, Higgins Clark sold her second suspense novel for $1.5 million. And you have to, those were $1970, by the way. In 1987, Higgins Clark was named president of the Mystery Writers of America. For many years, she served on the board of directors. Simon & Schuster, which has published all of Higgins Clark's novels, in the late 1990s, signed her to a $64 million contract and funded the Mary Higgins Clark Award to be given by the MWA to authors of suspense fiction. And that brings us to where we are today. She died in Naples, Florida on January 31st, 2020. She was 92 years old. That's a great story. Mm-hmm. And I want to just, before I introduce our panelists here, I'd like to just make a notation that Callie Hutton may be not seen, but she's here in spirit and in audio. So bear with us doing this little technical glitch. And I'm going to get started with introducing Catherine Cowley. Catherine, you want to wave a little bit? Okay, her novel, The Secret Lives of Mary Bennett, is one of this year's finalists for the Mary Higgins Clark Award. Catherine read Pride and Prejudice for the first time when she was 10 years old, which started a lifelong obsession with Jane Austen. She is the author of the Jane Austen Writing Lessons blog, and she teaches writing classes at Western Michigan University. Cowley lives in Kalamazoo, Michigan with her husband and 3 daughters. The Secret Life of Miss Mary Bennett is her debut novel. Congratulations, Catherine. Tracy Gardner. Wave, Tracy. Okay. Tracy is a Detroit native and a mother of 3. Tracy works as a nurse when out riding. Her novel, The Ruby Red Herring, is one of this year's Mary Higgins Clark Award finalists. Tracy lives with her husband and best friend of 30 years, along with a menagerie of spoiled rescue dogs and cats. I know that household. She is a strong believer in the power of baked goods, live music, family and friends, and as ingredients for a happy life. Our next panelist is Naomi Hirana. Naomi is a Edgar Award-winning mystery writer of multiple traditional mysteries. Did you wave, Naomi? Okay. Okay. Clark in Division is her first historical mystery. Naomi received her bachelor's degree in international relations from Stanford University and studied at the Inter-University Center for Advanced Japanese Language Studies in Tokyo. She also spent 3 months as a volunteer working in Ghana, West Africa. Naomi and her husband make their home in Southern California, and Naomi has served as chapter president of the Southern California chapter of Mystery Writers of America. Then there's Callie. Callie can't wave, but she's waving virtually. Callie Hutton's The Sign of Death is a finalist for this year's Mary Higgins Clark Award. She has penned more than 55 historical romance books and is said to write humorous and spicy Regency with historic elements and sensory details. Callie lives in Oklahoma with 2 rescue dogs and her top cheerleader husband of many years. And there's Elizabeth Penny. There she goes. Elizabeth's novel, Chapter and Curse, is a finalist for this year's Mary Higgins Clark Award. She is the author of more than 24 cozy mysteries, as well as works of women's fiction and romantic suspense. Elizabeth's writing credits include her over 30 mysteries and women's fiction novels and short stories. That's a lot. Elizabeth spent her early years in England and France and now lives in the White Mountains in New Hampshire, where she pens novels and tries to grow things. Mm-hmm. I would take an emphasis on the try. But anyway, okay, let's get started. We're really all happy to be here. I thought we'd start this conversation with, what about your book reflects Mary Higgins Clark tradition? And what do you think about what makes your book stand out as the mystery author? And what makes her stand out as a mystery author of suspense? Why don't you kick it off, Elizabeth?
Well, my book is about a young woman who moves to England. Her mother is from there, so she's starting off in a new place. I noticed when I looked at the list of characteristics that are included in this award, and one was that having strong family relationships, and she ends up running the bookstore with an aunt and her mother. So the family relationships are at the heart of the novel. And she's a librarian by trade, so solving mysteries is second nature to her because she likes to research and she's nosy. So that's yeah.
For suspense.
Just like the writer, right? So yeah, I was really excited to be nominated for this because Mary Higgins Clark is like the queen of these books. You know, I just have read so many of them, you know, many years ago before I ever dreamed of becoming published. And I want to go back and, you know, read the older ones again, just to refresh myself. But she had an amazing career. It's very inspiring.
Absolutely. What about you, Catherine?
Well, I mean, I just love, you know, exactly what Elizabeth said. You know, with Mary Higgins Clark, she really said, you know, female protagonists, ordinary people, you know, they don't have to be brilliant. They don't have to be amazing or have this amazing background. She often takes very ordinary people and puts them in these situations. And these women are able to kind of draw from their own courage and their own strength to solve the mystery. And, you know, some of hers are more kind of thriller or suspense style, is, you know, what we might call them now. And some of them are kind of more of a classic detective style. But either way, there's this sense that the female main character, she will get through this. She will be able to solve this, and she will find things in herself that are able to kind of get her through these complex situations. And that's something that I wanted to do in my novel, The Secret Life of Miss Mary Bennett. I've taken Mary Bennett, who's the boring, plain, dull sister from Pride and Prejudice, and I thought, okay, but she has to have something more to her, or she's going to live the rest of her life miserable. And I realized, well, she's actually a spy. So this book is kind of about her becoming a spy by solving a murder mystery. And I wanted to take this sense of, this overlooked person who, sometimes can be very awkward, very bumbling, not great in company, not the last person someone would expect to solve a mystery, and say, but she actually has all these skills that are perfect for solving a mystery. So that's something that I was trying to do. And I think just with Mary Higgins Clark, she's just like her breadth and her depth, and then the way that she constantly kind of mining different things for inspiration. She'd read something in a news report and it'd become a novel, or have a friend be, did you know about this law that real estate agents do this, and all of a sudden it becomes a novel. And I just love, just it's amazing how she was able to take anything for inspiration and turn it into a compelling story, and find kind of the heart of what makes it work. And all of her villains are they're motivated. Their motivations make sense. We can unravel this, and we unravel this with the characters.
We're going to talk about villains, I think, a little bit later, but that's a very good point. So, Naomi, what about you?
Well, I noticed that there's a theme among the panelists, because certainly with Clark and Division, it's a story about sisters, and it's a story about the younger sister who's kind of in the shadow of her older sister. And I think with Mary Higgins Clark, I mean, those kind of familiar relationships, I think even with her first book, was a younger sister or a sister trying to find out what happened to one of her sisters. And I think, yeah, so I really can relate to my fellow panelists and what they're trying to do with taking like the ordinary woman, and what makes it high stakes is the possible loss of a child, or another family member. And I think with Mary Higgins Clark, I when you just read how that she was a best-selling author, she sold all these books, she was the head of our organization, Mystery Writers of America. I mean, she really gave cred, to these type of books, and a certain respect. And I really am, whenever I went to like the Edgar Awards, and she's always immaculately dressed. So that's also personal inspiration for me.
I absolutely agree. Callie, I know we can't see you, but can we hear you respond? Callie? Okay, you're on mute, Callie. Or not.
Okay. You should be okay now, right?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. Might not be able to see me, but you can hear me. My inspiration from Mary Higgins Clark was actually a 11-book series that she wrote about a couple. Her character, Elvira, was a lottery winner, and her husband was a plumber, and she won all this money. So she decided to become this amateur sleuth. Well, my books, there's 3 books in this series. This one that's nominated as the second book is about a couple who belong to, and mine is set in the Victorian era in Bath, England. So they're a little bit different, I think, than the others, since it's a historical. And they, as a couple, solve issues. And there's an overall arc of romance to them, since I come from a romance background. And so they develop this relationship over the 3 books. And there's a lot of family relationships there. Her father makes an appearance in the book. She lives with her aunt. There's a brother that shows up in some of the various books. So there's a lot of family sort of thing, which I got from reading her books with about the 2 people who won the money and became amateur sleuths. I always liked her as a writer, because her writing is very tight. She keeps you on edge. She was also very prolific. So she had like a book, how many books did she have in her lifetime? Great many amount of books. So I always liked her for that. And as I said, I think it was her writing as a couple that made me think about doing one myself as a a man and a woman, and they're both of the nobility. So there's a certain other thing that comes into it that makes them a little bit different than perhaps other books. So just something a little different.
Tracy, can you weigh in on this one?
Yes. I think I was 11 or 12 when I read my first Mary Higgins Clark, and I don't even know how many I read. But like the term page turner, that The Cradle Will Fall, A Cry in the Night. I think you always remember those first few books that you read that make that impact on you, like just make you want to read more, but also I think I had already been writing short stories and that kind of thing, and it's just very inspiring. All of her protagonists they try very hard they're women, and they try so hard to solve their own problems. And I think that just resonated with me, I think with most women, to be able to show that strength and try to figure out solutions, try to solve their own problems. My main character in Ruby Red Herring, Avery Ayers, does that sometimes to her own detriment when maybe she should ask for help. She'd be better served trying to seek help. But again, I think that does tie back to a lot of what I read when I was younger with all of Mary Higgins Clark's novels. And then again, too, like the elements of suspense and the family dynamics, the kind of taking an ordinary woman, like Naomi said, and kind of putting her into these extraordinary circumstances that, and yet she's still got the relationship with the sister and an aunt, and she has to check in on her dad, and, things that I think we all can relate to. So.
Absolutely. I think too, it comes to a point, and we have a tendency, I think, sometimes to put things in cubby holes, like what's the difference between suspense and a whodunit or a mystery? Is really a mystery just another word for suspense? A suspense, are they interchangeable? Or is there just a little nuance to a suspense, say, that makes it different from a mystery, from a whodunit? I didn't know if any thoughts on that?
I like what Tracy said about a page turner, that was something very special about Mary Higgins Clark. And I think when I wrote Clark in Division, usually I actually come up with the characters and then the mystery kind of comes. But with this one, it was more like just imagining, if this happened, then what? It was more that kind of conceit. I mean, not that, everybody goes to that, but for this particular book that I wrote, that was the inciting kind of incident. And I think perhaps with a lot of Mary Higgins Clark's books, you could still have a whodunit. But I think if you have this strong inciting incident, then there's something, it's just like lining a bunch of dominoes up and then, poking at one of them, and they all start naturally, organically coming down.
I think too, suspense novels have their own niche in that they bring the story, backstory is prevalent. You've got a lot coming, and it's like a momentum building, and then you have this tsunami of mystery. There's an element of mystery, but there's an element of mystery to getting up the next day. But I think a suspense novels tend to have a little bit more of a nuance to them, which brings me to all of you in some way or another, and be it suspense, mystery, whatever you want to call it, have to do a lot of research. All of your books, I've read them all of your novels reflect a fair amount of research, either because of the subject matter or because of the historical context in which it was written. And I was going to ask you, did each of you actually, I think a lot of readers want to know, well, do you do your research as you go along, or do you do it at the beginning and then start writing? Elizabeth, you're shaking your head. Yes.
Yeah, well, I do a little bit at first when I develop the story, excuse me, but then I tend to do it as I go along and write, because I don't want, once I get into the book, I don't want to, if I just did research, when would I ever write it? You know what I mean? It's almost like I have to jump in, and then as I write, then I end up researching stuff, and then I get a new idea and I have to research that. And it all just kind of dovetails as I go along. So I'm constantly, like, probably every day when I'm writing, I'm looking something up, and the most random weird stuff half the time, because I like to be accurate, when I write stuff. Like, it could happen even though it's fiction. So I do a lot of research.
Tracy, you not the historical context so much, but just the subject matter. You're a perfect example of that. Did you have to do a lot of research for that, or does it come naturally, or do you have a hobby? Or
No, I think the answer to that is both. I did a lot of research beforehand, and then I think maybe when you start writing, you think, okay, I've got all my ducks in a row. I know what I need to know. But then, you hit, I would hit periodically every few chapters, something that I would have to look much deeper into, because same thing that Elizabeth said, you don't want somebody to read your book who, like in my case, my main character is an antiques appraiser. An antiques appraiser could read my book, and I don't want her to be like, oh, well, that would never happen, and that's not how that works, and there's no such thing as that piece of equipment. So I think I definitely did as much as I could beforehand, but then throughout too.
Okay. What about you, Naomi?
Well, I was deathly afraid because I'm a Los Angelino and I'm writing a book set in Chicago. And it was during a period of time in which I was not alive, 1944. So for this book, I was very much wedded to history and doing the research. And it was very important for me to get things accurate, because there's not anything out there like this that's talks about Japanese Americans, being released from World War II camps and, going into Chicago. There's not much in terms of nonfiction. So actually, I was kind of using the mystery genre to kind of fill in the blanks. So it involved going there, like good friendships with social historians, doing a lot of internet research, looking at oral histories. And it just naturally, actually, the facts kind of led to, the writing of the book. So, but people really keep me honest. I just got something on Twitter. Some guy in Chicago said he's looking forward to reading the book, but he noticed that the cover, the photo, was not of Clark and Division. It was another intersection of Chicago. So yeah, people are really looking at this very carefully.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Catherine, what about you?
I kind of a mixture of what everyone is doing. Kind of like Elizabeth said, I do a fair bit of research before, but at a certain point you have to stop. So I actually had the idea for this book in 2013, and I did some initial research, and then I saw that there was a book being written, a nonfiction book about Regency spies. And so I decided I'm going to wait to write this book until this scholar does all the heavy lifting on this for me. So I waited a few years before I started to write the book. So then that was something, because I really wanted to connect the book to the Napoleonic Wars and kind of have Napoleon Bonaparte kind of have an arc, even though he's not on the page, kind of a backdrop to the trilogy. And so then the other thing I really researched a lot before was trying to find a location. I wanted something that was inspired by Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, kind of that Gothic feel that she was evoking. And so I wanted to find, a real building and then make it my own and give it a new name, but kind of in a real place, and then using that. So I ended up finding a castle called Castle Goring that was built, actually, I think it was by Percy Bysshe Shelley's grandparents or something like that. You can go look it up and correct me, but it's correct my acknowledgments in the book. So that's what matters. Anyway, so they built this castle, but it wasn't a real castle because there's very strict requirements in England for what is a castle, and it doesn't have any actual fortifications that could be for defense. It doesn't have remnants of an old castle. All these reasons, it's not actually a castle, even though it's called a castle. And the front of the castle looks like, you know, a classic castle, and then the back looks like this Italian villa. So it's this kind of very unusual architecture, and it's this protected building in England because of this distinctive architecture. And so I realized, okay, this is the place. And then all of a sudden I'm like, okay, and I'm next to, you know, the English Channel. And that is right where in the book on Regency spies, you had the risk of Napoleon invading, and there were threats of that happening. And so all of a sudden things started to come together. So I did all this research, and then I started writing. And, you know, as Tracy and others have said, you know, it's this constant like looking things up or discovering things, and incorporating that. And then I ended up going back after third or fourth draft. And then I went and read all the newspapers every day for the course of the whole book to choose a newspaper excerpt. And then, of course, I changed things in every chapter because of other things I read in the newspaper. So it's just this constant, you know, revision process. But it adds kind of, especially with historical mystery, these real details I feel like add to the suspense. They add to the realness. And it becomes more mysterious than just sometimes making something up by knowing, oh, this was the real threat. This was the real way they locked their letters. This was the real way they did this. It actually like increases the mystery.
Wow. It's like a tapestry. That's, you make it sound like it's a tapestry. Callie,
Yes.
what about you? You've got a lot of history.
Well, I have a degree in education with a minor in history. So I've always been very interested in history. So obviously the things I write are historical. I did a lot of research beforehand. I took a trip to Bath, England, in fact, and spent a couple of weeks there, taking pictures, doing research, talking to people, that sort of thing. And then I did a lot of research when I got back. But like everyone else said, you think you've got not everything, but you think you've got a good solid start. And then 10 times a day, I'm on the internet looking at this, looking at that. I also keep up on my website an online etymology, so I can look up a word and see if it was used in that time period.
Wow.
And yeah, yeah, you have to be careful with stuff. And then trying to solve a mystery or a murder when you have not the sort of equipment and skills that they have today. I had to go back and say, you know, what year did this start and what year did they do this? And, you know, so I'd make sure I have everything done correctly, because as someone else mentioned, someone's going to find your mistake and they're going to mention it. So you have to be real careful. So my research is pretty much at the beginning, because I outline everything to start. And then as I go along, I have to keep, you know, looking up this and looking up that. And as someone else said, then you have to go back sometimes and change something you wrote before because you found out that it wasn't necessarily true. So research does take a lot of your, especially if you're writing anything you're writing takes a lot of research. But when you're doing historical, it's dual research, because you've got the time period as well as what can happen.
Callie, I'd like you to sort of piggyback on what you just said and ask everybody about it. But when you're writing fiction, which is either historically significant or, as Tracy was mentioning, the topic is significant, how much deference do you give to the contemporary reader? You know, especially in how you choose your choice of words or your or property or whatever, because you can kind of get bogged down too, you know, with people not understanding, because this is the 21st century and you're talking about another time period. Callie, can you kick us off with that? Do you give deference to your readers?
I do put at the back of my books, I usually put author's notes, and I will put things that they may not be aware of. And maybe some research that I did that showed, you know, there's different things that I use in the book. But basically, I would say my fan base is pretty much historical. They like historical books, whether they're romance books or mysteries. I have had a lot of people who did leave reviews and said, you know, I've never read much in the way of historical mysteries, but this was kind of interesting to read. But I would say that most times the people that are reading my books are kind of familiar with the time period. And just in case they're not, I do those notes at the end of the book about what I've seen and the type of research that I did that brought different things up that they might not be aware of.
Okay, what about you, Catherine?
Well, I do feel like, you know, that sometimes I do make, certain choices. For example, Jane Austen will use the phrase, Edmund was making love to Mary Crawford. And that means something very different today. So even though it would be historically accurate in my Jane Austen spinoff to use that phrase, I don't use that phrase. I use other phrases that she used to describe flirting. And so there's certain names, like the name Tiffany feels so modern to readers, even though it's, I don't know, 500 years old. It's been used in Britain for a long time. So there are some times where I I do think about it, and sometimes I'll still make the choice, even if it's going to throw the reader, even if they're going to think this is a modern word, even though it was used way more in the 1800s. Sometimes I'll still do it, but sometimes I'll say, hey, there are other ways that I can say this.
Very good. Tracy.
Ruby Red Herring is it's very contemporary.
Right.
But I did feel like you're constantly kind of walking that line between giving enough information about, the ins and outs of whatever it is that my protagonist, the antiques appraiser, what she's doing, what she is, she's authenticating a jewel. I tried to give it as much as possible that was relevant. But I mean, sometimes I would catch myself kind of running away with too many details that just because I learned them from researching and just because I know them doesn't mean that anybody else wants to know that while they're, it would take away from the pacing. So, yeah.
Elizabeth?
Well, one issue I had, my main character is American. She's actually from Vermont. And so in the first book, I have her, she talks about, the English say things a certain way, a certain phrase, and this is what it means. And then some people, it's funny because some people were, thank you for doing that. And then other people were like, don't, you did that too much. We all know what that means. So there was that balance. I think in the second book, I didn't even worry about it, but it was hard because okay, if you're we're Americans, right? And we go to England, there might be some phrases we're not familiar with. Maybe we are if we read a lot or we watch a lot of British shows or something, but we might not be. So I had that to balance out. I did that on purpose. So I made her American because I figured most of my readers are probably from the United States. So that I wanted them to feel like they were stepping into her shoes. That's back to the Mary Higgins Clark thing. When you say she uses ordinary women, I think she's probably got the most relatable heroines, right? I mean, so many books, the heroine is beautiful. She's a, concert pianist. She's genius. She's this, that, there's so many books like that where the hero and heroine are like these goddesses and gods, right? And, ours aren't, well, mine aren't. She's just a regular person. So I want my readers to feel like they're going along for the ride with my person, so make it kind of immersive that way.
Naomi.
Probably the most controversial aspect of my books in general is I integrate a lot of Japanese, it's like either dialect or Japanese. And it's kind of like what Elizabeth was saying, you're going to have people, these two camps, some people really dislike it and other people love it. And I've just come to this stage in my career, I think, I don't want to be vanilla, I want to embrace because I love a lot of Jewish writers. I love Yiddish. I know what mensch is. Why can't I incorporate language that I've heard here in America? And a lot of things are in the dictionary, like mise, ise, that means first generation and second generation. And it's like, I know a lot of things about English tutor. I know all these weird, weapons and, just from reading. And it's like, okay, here I'm going to put something out and hopefully readers will kind of get the rhythm of it and learn some new words that are in the dictionary and just incorporate it as regular, American English.
All of you, as I said, I've read your books, and one thing just struck me when you were speaking, Naomi, so I'm going to kick off with you. your villains, how, because your historic villains or your maybe psychological villain, or sometimes it's an interior villain. Tell me a little bit about the villain in your books. Naomi, you go first.
Well, actually, one of the villains is more cultural, I think it's silence, like because these people have gone through this very traumatic situation in order for them, because this is people who are released from camp and they're trying to, put their lives together. And one thing, even within the community and outside the community, it's like, don't talk about it. Don't talk about what we went through. And that's what my protagonist, Aki, is kind of dealing with. But because she's so devoted to her older sister, she's not going to let, that villainous silence, take over.
And Callie, what about you?
Actually, my books have more than one villain. Like one of my books, the villain is killed, so they had to find a second villain. And it kind of like, it's hard to say that what the villains are like, because it's for different reasons. Some are personal, some is, it's hard to say. They're all have different reasons, but there's always more than one villain in each one of my books.
Do you pick a particular type of trait or something that stands out in your mind as something that the protagonist is coming up against? Or, and
Well,
before you do that, I just want to encourage everybody to ask questions. Go to your Q&A or Q and ask questions. Go ahead, Callie.
Well, my protagonist, because someone talked before about how some of the heroes and heroines are perfect and everything. My protagonist she's short, she's overweight, she wears the wrong shoes, nothing ever matches. She's just that type of person, but she's very smart. She happens to be a mystery author, writing under a man's name, because in those days she couldn't, her father did not approve of her being an author. So she's not what you'd call a perfect person. And what was the rest of your question?
No, just pretty much how do you build an antagonist or an antagonist type for your protagonist? In other words, what are they fighting against? Where's the confrontation or the controversy?
Well, since my books have a couple, the female protagonist is fighting against the fact that she has to hide herself as being an author. She is not taken seriously when she comes up with these ideas for what could be something that would solve the murder. A lot of times she has to use the male partner as the person to actually present everything, because she's not granted any respect. So I would say she's pretty much up against the time period when women were not considered to be smart, or they shouldn't be doing anything except staying at home and doing whatever. So that's what I would say is what she's fighting. The male protagonist isn't really up against anything. He's just, I would say it's really her that has the arc through all three books about what she's trying to prove to the world and to herself.
Okay, all right. What about you, Tracy?
I tend to like to all of my villains have some kind of personal relationship with the main character. They're in their lives in some way, shape, or form, because it just to add that personal stake, because it seems like it raises the stakes. It makes it, as I'm writing it makes it that much more impactful for me, keeps me invested in the story as I'm writing it, because it's upsetting. You don't want to think that somebody that someone close to you, could be the villain in your life. And then the main character in Ruby Red Herring is, as well, I think we all have internal and external villains. Right. And she has a very on the page real struggle with an anxiety disorder that has developed as a result of the inciting incident at the beginning of this book. And I wanted to portray that correctly, because it's a very real things. So I thought it was important to show that, yes, she's dealing with this. It affects her life. And that is definitely a internal villain for her that she's forced to deal with too.
Catherine.
In mine, for the first book in the series, this novel that we're talking about, Mary doesn't know any of the villains, or any of the suspects. She's in a new place with new people. So none of these people are people that she has any background with. And so the story, like the internal arc, is about her finding herself and deciding who she wants to be and becoming. And this external arc, a lot of it, it's about investigating, Napoleon Bonaparte is this existential threat, but it's looking at these people in town, these people that she's living with, and saying, who is not being loyal to our country? Who is not being loyal to, what they said they do? And so in some sense, the villain, it's puzzling out, what really is a threat? What really is a threat, just both to me as a person and to our people and our way of life, and figuring that out.
Elizabeth.
Well, in this story, Molly, she moves to Cambridge and she immediately finds out that her new life is under threat because the cousin wants to sell the bookstore. So, here they are embarking on a new life, this 400-year-old bookstore, and it might get snatched away. And so she immediately is invested in figuring out how she can save it. And so the same thing happens when this sort of unpleasant neighbor is found murdered in the garden, and in the garden of the bookshop. So now the murder is on her doorstep. Her aunt is a suspect. And a lot of this is, you could say, it's sort of genre specific. This happens a lot in, cozy mysteries. You have to have the murder has to be close enough that there's a reason for the sleuth to get involved. And usually, a family member, a friend, or even the sleuth themselves is the suspect. So she's, go ahead.
No.
Oh. Okay, yeah. So she gets involved in, she doesn't want her aunt to be, arrested for murder. So she gets involved. As far as like choosing villains, I always, there's always a roster of people too. You've got to have enough suspects. So every person has to, have a reason they could have done it. And so, but then I try not to make everyone like totally awful, because then, some books I've read where everyone's so negative that you feel, it's kind of just too, I don't know, I don't like that either. So it's sort of a balance. Like the characters have to be kind of realistic, kind of likable, but they could be a murderer. If you have someone who's horrible from the start, you might think that's the murderer. It's sort of a balancing act like that. But I guess I try to create motivations for people why they do it. And
One thing, we have a question from our audience, and they're asking, have any of you ever wanted to be an amateur sleuth? Nodding, and here comes Catherine. Catherine, take it away.
So when I was about 10 or 11 years old, I was really into the Encyclopedia Brown books, and I'd get done with every single book. And it wasn't that I wanted to be the sleuth. I was like, I could have committed this crime better, so Encyclopedia Brown would not have caught me. And I'm like, I totally wouldn't have made that mistake. I would have covered that up. I would have done these things. So kind of the reverse side of things of like wanting to kind of puzzle out, not that I've ever had any actual interest in committing crime, but like from like a hypothetical standpoint, like that puzzle of how would you, that has, I guess, always fascinated me from a young age.
Tracy, you're kind of smiling. Is it bringing back fond memories?
No, I think my answer to that question would be no way. I am, it's a lot of fun to write about, but I would be way too concerned about getting in trouble. I wouldn't break enough rules to be able to ever figure out who did it. So I'd be a terrible sleuth.
Hey, Callie, what about you?
No, really, it never crossed my mind to be a sleuth. I like writing about it. I like figuring out the crime and figuring out how they're going to solve it. But as far as doing it myself, no, I don't think so. That's not my thing.
Naomi?
I did some investigating when I worked as a journalist. And I know one time I talked to like the relative of this man who was suspected for murder, and he said to me over the phone, do you know that why are you asking? And I said something like, well, I'm just curious. And he goes, well, curiosity killed the cat. So it was kind of scary, but I think when it really happens to you, like in your circle, I don't, I think my emotions kind of take over, and it's hard for me to be super logical or analytical.
Or curious, huh? Don't you think that? I think an amateur sleuth has to have a very strong curiosity bone. Elizabeth.
Well, I actually, I don't know what I would do if I had a murder in my close circle, but I am fascinated by true crime. Some cases where it's interesting to analyze what could have happened and then look at all the clues and, just wanting answers. I think that's part of what drives sleuths, is that, there was one case, is a woman disappeared about 20 years ago here in New Hampshire, and like people have gone nuts over it online. Maura Murray is her name. It's a rabbit hole, believe me. So that's an example of just, you want to find out what happened to her. So I think that I do have that curiosity. Naomi mentioned journalism. I've done that too. And I love to find stories. I love to talk to people and find out things, put the pieces together, the puzzle pieces, and kind of use some intuition too. So I guess in theory, I might like it. I don't know if I'd actually like it though.
I don't you think too that puzzle solving gene that you have, it's like the vicarious pleasure of setting up a puzzle and saying, almost like you're saying, Catherine, I can solve this. I can, because you have to be able to solve the puzzle because you're writing the book, right? You've solved the mystery. You've done the sleuthing already. Which brings me to the eternal question that writers tend to get asked: plotters versus pantsters. Okay, we're writing suspense novels here. What do you do? Do you plot, or do you work by an outline? I think I heard somebody mention outline earlier. Or do you work by the seat of your pants and take each day as it comes? Elizabeth.
Well, actually, I'm a natural pantser, and the books I wrote initially, I just had an idea and an image and a person, and I went for it. But then I got into writing cozy mysteries, and I've done quite a bit of work for hire. That's where all those dozens of mysteries came in, and the editor required an outline, and then I was like, oh no, because I am not a natural outliner. It is painful. I would rather write the book than do the outline. Put it that way. Because I love the flow. I love being in the image in my mind of the story. But when you write a mystery, I have to plan, because you want to be able to have it be logical and fit together with clues that are dropped in or things that happen that kind of create an arc of action, right? So, I mean, I think and what I hate even more would be going back and rewriting all that. So I've learned to love outlining because it helps save a lot of time and energy, and then you can focus on the story.
Sounds great. Naomi.
I personally, I don't like the two camps of pantser, and what was the other one?
It's a plotter.
Yeah, pantser or plotter, because I really think people who are pantsers, intuitively, they kind of know the beats. It's kind of like music. If you've been soaked in music and when a certain beat's supposed to happen, maybe they don't write it down in outline form, but in their minds they kind of know. So I feel like sometimes I write it down, sometimes I don't, but I think my mind subconsciously it's putting those things here in my head.
That's well said. Well said. What about you, Catherine?
Well, my first draft and my second draft and my third draft did not have a dead body. So I am an outliner in that I have to outline in order to get some of the structure and get the book. But it took many drafts and lots of help from other people before I figured out what the mystery was and, how to go from just like lots of suspenseful, crazy things to like having a core mystery. So, and, my third novel in the series is actually the first novel that I have written where I've had the actual plot and the subplots all in the first draft. which was very unusual and very nice. But a lot of times, so I do outline, but it's this constant process of I'm discovering things as I go, and I change things, and then I modify things, and then I don't figure everything out until the second or the third draft, and then I go back and change the structure and bring other things in. So, as Naomi said, for me, it's a lot more fluid of a process than just like, am I one or the other?
Tracy?
I would say I'm a loose plotter. I know the beginning and end, and I know the major points along the way. And as I go, I'll make myself little notes about what happens, chapter by chapter. But that's about as detailed as I get. But I think what Naomi said is just spot on for me. That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
Callie?
I do an outline of the book before I start. I'm also a very linear writer. I don't do a draft. When I'm finished with my book, it's done. I go through it again just to make changes, little tiny changes and stuff. But I'm pretty much writing the final copy when I write it. So I have a completely outlined, but obviously as you go along, things happen that you think, oh, maybe I should do this, and you change what your outline is. But basically, I know pretty much where I'm going and with the book. And my husband is my brainstorm person, so we sit a lot and go over it, and he'll give me ideas. And but basically, I've got the outline done before I start, and then just make changes along the way.
Okay. We have a question again from our audience is, do you think your protagonists in your books that are being considered here mirror yourself? Catherine?
I mean, in some ways, part of what interested me about Mary is that this sense of not always feeling comfortable in all social situations. I am much more comfortable in social situations than Mary Bennett is by far. But just some of my own circumstances were like, oh, that interaction did not go how I wanted. I wish I could take that back. Wow, I didn't read the room. And now I can look back and say, maybe I should have been a little more aware of that. And so, I was kind of channeling definitely, my moments of when I've, maybe struggled in social interactions and put that into Mary. And I'm the oldest of 6 children, and Mary has 4 siblings. And so like large family dynamics, I was like, I've got that down. Playing the pianoforte, ooh, I don't have to look anything up. I know how to do that. And I also think I'm better than I actually am, just like Mary. So those are the sorts of things. And then everything else was, really trying to go into the character and figure out things that are different than me.
Got it. Tracy?
I'm like and different than Avery. Avery is a very hardcore runner, and I don't run ever for any reason. But I loved writing that about her, and it allowed me to do some really fun research too. But Avery also is the master of her own fate, and again, sometimes to her own detriment. And that is me too. So she's, definitely has a lot in common with me.
Some a little bit, some and a little bit less. Callie?
Well, I've written about 58 books, and I see myself in just about every single book that I've written.
Wow.
My characters always have something of myself in it, and I never thought about it until I probably was like 30 or 35 books in, and someone mentioned it, and I went back and looked at the different books and the plots, and I thought, yeah, there's a little bit of me just about every person I've written about. And there's a lot of my heroes have my husband's characteristics too. So I guess I've been writing about us for years.
58 books, for sure. Elizabeth?
Well, Molly's a book nerd, and so am I. And I think if I didn't have the career I did, I would love to be a librarian. And that's what her career is. Then to own a bookstore, both, sound like dream jobs to me. So she loves books. She loves old books. The second book features children's books, fairy tales, and I always have loved those. So, and I think, so a little bit of my personality in there, her being nosy and curious and that kind of thing. But she's younger, and I don't know, these characters, they seem to take on their own life. It's sort of interesting, and probably someone else could tell me better, is that character like me? Because I don't know. I created this person and she seems real to me, which is kind of odd, but you know.
It's not odd. It's not odd. Naomi.
Yeah, some friends have said that Clark and Division, the protagonist, it's first person, they feel that voice is my voice more than any other book I've written. But I totally disagree because I don't have any sisters. There's a lot of things we're very different. But I guess the one thing I share with my protagonist is being a daughter of an immigrant and being very protective of our immigrant parents. I do understand that tendency. So I think that's the one thing we do have in common.
Okay, just your suspense writers. What are you reading? What's on your nightstand, Naomi?
Well, I am just loving Gary Phillips' book, One Shot Harry. I do some Q&As for a local newspaper, so it's kind of work related, but it's got LA, and history. And then Gary Phillips, he's just a very long time friend. So and during the pandemic, I love Ellie Griffiths. I've become this I'm a diehard fan. So if she's ever at a mystery conference, I'm going to be, fangirling her for sure.
Oh, it's funny. I feel the same way. Elizabeth, what about you?
Well, I'm a pretty eclectic reader. I do love suspense, mysteries, rom-com, and I'm also working on a historical World War II era book. So I've been reading a lot of that now. But recently I started reading Women on Fire by Lisa Barr, and that's got World War II and art. And I love books with art. I don't know. That's one of my other passions is art history and art. So I love reading about it.
Okay, Callie.
I tend to read whatever it is I'm writing at the time. It kind of keeps me using the correct words and phrases and stuff. Right now I'm writing a Highlander series, so I'm reading a lot of Highlanders books. When I was writing my cozy mystery, I read mystery books. I just kind of read whatever it is I'm writing to keep me focused, especially if it's something where I need to have certain accents or certain words that were only used at that particular time period. So it kind of keeps me from making big, huge mistakes with vocabulary more than anything. Though I do want to say one thing is I have a friend in the UK. She's actually a fan. She wrote to me a long time ago, and she reads all of my books and picks out the Americanisms. And so I get to correct those. Yeah. She's a gem. She's an absolute gem. And the next time I go to Bath, in fact, I'm going to meet up with her, but she corrects all of my Americanisms, which is a big help.
Oh, I would think so. Yes. Catherine.
My to read pile is about 2 miles high. One of the books that I'm excited to read, I loved Mia Manansala's Arsenic and Adobo that came out last year, and I'm just dying to read the second book in the series, which is already out. So I'm like, why haven't I read this already? So that's what I'm especially looking forward to.
I read it. It's a great book. Tracy.
I'm in the middle of Mr. Mercedes right now. There was a time when I had read everything Stephen King had written, and then I had kids and I fell way behind. So I'm trying to catch up. He is just probably my favorite author. Can't write at all what he what he writes, but I love reading him. So
I know the feeling. Feeling. Well, panelists, you won't believe this. The time has gone by so fast, but we have concluded this wonderful discussion, and I've enjoyed it. I hope you have, and I hope our audience has. And I just want to thank you each. Thank you very much for participating and for being such great writers, and congratulations on being nominated.